Could a severed head still see or understand? The question came almost at once. The guillotine was sold as a faster, less painful execution. Then witnesses stared into the basket and said severed heads still moved. Some claimed the face kept signs of awareness for several seconds after the blade fell, and that argument never left the guillotine. Before that argument took hold, Europe already had an older language of execution, and the crowd knew how to read it. In the 16th and 17th centuries, public killings filled the square as displays of power, and the method followed rank. A nobleman condemned for a grave crime met a sword or an axe, because people treated beheading as the more merciful end. A poor offender, without title or money, went to the rope, where strangulation could drag on for several minutes. Then came the wheel. The executioner struck the arms, the legs, and the spine with a heavy iron bar, and the raised wheel turned punishment into a lesson for everyone watching. The rope took minutes, the wheel took hours, and even beheading still depended on the executioner's hand. And when the blade came down, skill still decided the outcome. A trained swordsman with a sharp blade could take a head cleanly in one stroke. An axe made that far harder. It was heavier, harder to control, and far less forgiving. One wrong move was enough. If the condemned shifted or the angle was off, the cut slipped. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed at Fotheringhay Castle in England. Elizabeth I had kept her imprisoned for 19 years. The axe took 3 blows. After that, the executioner still had to saw through the remaining tissue with the blade's edge. 300 witnesses watched in visible shock. Botched executions were not rare. They were practically routine, and crowds who came expecting a swift, formal death often turned angry. The suffering was intentional. The more visible it became, the clearer the message. France in the 1780s ran the same method. Botched beheadings had not changed the code. In the late 1780s, France still kept the same order of execution. On December 1, 1789, the Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin carried that issue into the French National Assembly. The revolution was 6 months old, and deputies were drafting a new legal order after declaring citizens equal before the law. Guillotin argued that equality could not stop at the scaffold. An aristocrat and a poor laborer had to die by one method, with the same speed and the least suffering possible. His answer was a beheading device that would cut the same way each time without depending on the executioner's skill or mood. Then he added one line about the condemned feeling only a slight sensation at the back of the neck. The chamber burst into laughter. Mockery did not survive the law. In 1791, France rewrote its penal code and ordered the same death for every condemned person, whatever their birth: decapitation. Equality now sat on the page, but the country could not carry it out by hand. France lacked trained executioners, and teaching skilled swordsmen would have taken years. So the authorities turned Guillotin's proposal into a build order. A legal rule had become a design problem. They gave the project to Antoine Louis, the permanent secretary of the French Academy of Surgery. Louis then worked with Tobias Schmidt, a German instrument maker. By early 1792, they had a working prototype. One detail decided everything. Louis and Schmidt set the blade at 45 degrees instead of dropping a straight edge like an axe, because a flat blow needed more force and could miss a clean cut. The angled blade crossed the neck diagonally. It cut faster, and it cut more reliably. That angled blade faced its first proof in April 1792. At the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris, officials tested the prototype on fresh corpses on April 17th, and the result matched the design. They laid the condemned face down on a flat wooden bascule, then tipped the board forward until the neck reached the cutting gap. A curved wooden lunette held the neck in place, and a matching upper piece pressed down from above. Then, a blade of about 7 kilograms dropped from roughly 3 meters, running along greased wooden rails with a short, dull impact. The interval from restraint to the blade's fall lasted only seconds. That speed changed the public scene at once. On April 25th, they used the device on a living man for the first time, Nicolas Jacques Pelletier, executed at the Place de Grève in central Paris. The crowd had expected the old pattern, with several visible minutes of suffering before death. Witnesses later remembered not satisfaction, but confusion, because the procedure ended before the square could settle into the familiar rhythm of a public execution. That sudden speed fixed another detail. After the first public execution, Paris remembered not Antoine Louis, but Guillotin. At first, people said Louisette or Louison. His loud campaign for reform tied his surname to the device, and the link held. Guillotin kept trying to separate himself from it, but contemporaries said it burdened him for life. He died in 1814, aged 75. His family asked the French government to rename it. The government refused. The name survived. The promise did not. Less than a year after the first execution, the guillotine stood at the center of one of the largest government-organized mass killings in European history. By late 1792, the revolution had already moved far from liberty and equal rights. France was fighting Austria and Prussia, and both monarchies wanted the uprising crushed before it spread into their own countries. The blade already had a public procedure, so those in power did not need to invent a new punishment during the crisis. Food ran short, prices collapsed, and rival political groups fought each other for control of the government. In April 1793, power gathered an emergency body of 12 men. Before that 12-man committee tightened its grip, the revolution had already crossed a line. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI went to the Place de la Révolution. Today, it is Place de la Concorde. He was 38. They killed him in public. Since June 1791, he had lived under house arrest. He and his family tried to flee France disguised as servants. Officials caught them at Varennes, near the Belgian border. No European government had ever publicly killed its own ruling monarch through a formal legal process. By April, the Committee of Public Safety held effective control. Every royal court understood the message. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette would walk to the same square. That verdict did not stop with the king. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette went to the same scaffold. She was 37. The conciergerie kept her alone for 2.5 months in a former royal palace turned prison, cut off from her children. The youngest was 8. Then the pattern spread. From September 1793 to July 1794, the terror made death sentences ordinary. The Paris Revolutionary Tribunal alone handed down 2,600 death sentences. Across France, officials recorded about 16,500 executions. And even that was not the full count. Historians estimate another 10,000 to 40,000 people died in prisons without any trial. One isolated cell, then a country of prison doors and court lists. 2,600 death sentences in Paris, and about 16,500 official executions across France. Once the tribunals filled that many pages, the label "Enemy of the Revolution" no longer stayed narrow. At first, officials targeted aristocrats, priests who refused the oath to the new government, and suspected foreign spies. The list kept widening fast. By the middle of 1794, grain merchants accused of overcharging, farmers who missed supply quotas, and citizens reported by neighbors for talk at dinner all went to the scaffold. That shift changed the count. In June and July of 1794, the guillotine in Paris killed 50 to 60 people a day. Charles-Henri Sanson was the chief executioner in Paris. His family had held that office since 1688, and he had already executed Louis XVI himself. He then carried out hundreds more. Later, Sanson said the pace had become unmanageable. His assistants rotated in shifts because the condemned kept arriving, and the blade had to stay ready from one group to the next. Even the square gave way.
Authorities moved the executions from the Place de la Révolution to the Place du Trône Renversé because blood draining from the scaffold fouled the water of a nearby fountain.
City order was starting to show the strain. On July 28, 1794, Robespierre was led to the scaffold. That widening purge finally reached the man most closely tied to its scale. Maximilien Robespierre was 36, a lawyer, a politician, and the strongest voice on the Committee of Public Safety. Guards arrested him and brought him to the scaffold at the Place de la Révolution. He came there already broken. By then, his lower jaw was shattered. The day before, a gunshot had smashed it, and historians still argue whether another man fired or Robespierre did. A blood-soaked bandage held the wound together. Then it came off. Before the executioner locked his neck into the lunette, he tore the bandage away. Robespierre cried out. Then the lunette closed. After that day, the organized mass executions stopped. The blade fell. Even after the killing slowed, one argument stayed at the scaffold. Doctors kept returning to one plain detail. A severed head could still move, and movement alone proved nothing. People nearby reported blinking, a working jaw, and a face that seemed to change in the short pause after the dry drop of the blade. Then the dispute started. Did the person still perceive anything, or were the nerves firing their last signals? Doctors pointed to the headless chicken because a body can act for seconds without the brain. Early observers had no instruments, only eyes and memory. They were left with blinking, jaw movement, and a shifting face. Then one case gave the argument a face. Charlotte Corday was 24, from Normandy, and the guillotine took her on July 17, 1793. She had killed Jean-Paul Marat. Marat was no minor target. He was one of the Revolution's most influential radical journalists, and Corday stabbed him while he sat in a medicinal bath for a painful skin disease. Then the assistant intervened. An executioner's assistant lifted her head and struck her cheek while holding it up before the crowd. Several witnesses said the face reacted at once, with an expression they read as outrage or anger. Hours later, Paris was repeating the story. No one could prove what the movement meant. But one slap after the blade turned street talk into a case doctors and scientists started to treat seriously. That question did not stay in the streets. More than a century later, one French doctor went to the scaffold to watch, record, and test. On the 28th of June, 1905, Gabriel Bourriot attended the execution of convicted murderer Henri Longueuil at the prison in Orléans. He placed himself beside the scaffold for one reason only: to observe the severed head the instant the blade fell. In the first seconds, Bourriot saw Longueuil's eyelids and lips twitch in uneven bursts, then settle. He called Longueuil's name, loudly and clearly. The closed lids opened, the eyes shifted, and Bourriot wrote that they fixed on his face for 5 to 6 seconds with focused attention. He called the name again, and he saw one more short response before the eyes closed for good. That second answer mattered because a repeated response to a name gave doctors something closer to a record than rumor. Bourriot published the account in the French journal Archives d'Anthropologie Criminelle, and he left convinced that he had seen not a reflex, but a brief remnant of consciousness. A written record still meets a harder limit: blood. The blade cuts both carotid arteries, the two large vessels that keep the brain supplied with fresh oxygenated blood. The brain is only about 2% of body mass, but it burns roughly a fifth of the body's oxygen. Cut that flow, and the margin collapses fast. Blood drains from the head almost at once. Pressure inside the brain falls close to zero within 1 to 2 seconds. Outside, a witness may still catch a movement or a fixed look. Inside, the tissue is already crossing its last physiological line. Pilots under sudden high G-forces black out in about 5 to 10 seconds, when blood is pushed away from the brain. Animal experiments that stop cerebral blood flow abruptly land in the same range. So even a precise observation at the scaffold would sit at the edge, not inside a stable state of awareness. In 2011, Radboud University in the Netherlands pulled that question back into modern science. A Dutch study finally replaced scaffold testimony with a recording. In PNAS, the Journal of the United States National Academy of Sciences, researchers measured rat brain activity right after decapitation. The trace jumped. For the first 3 to 5 seconds, it showed a brief burst of gamma oscillations. In living brains, that band tracks active sensory processing. Then it fell. Activity dropped fast after that spike, and the team did not call it proof of consciousness. They stopped there. They only showed the cutoff was not instantaneous. By about 30 seconds, the electrical signal was gone. That brief electrical trace left behind the oldest witness claim. A blinking eyelid, a shifting jaw, a face that seemed to change. The brainstem sits above the spinal cord and controls breathing, heart rhythm, and other automatic functions. For a short time after the higher parts stop, it can still trigger simple reflexes in the face. Blinking, jaw movement, and small changes in muscle tension fit that pattern and do not need conscious control. After 1794, the guillotine kept operating for another 183 years, and those reports kept returning. The color seen in Charlotte Corday's cheeks after the slap most likely came from blood vessels widening on impact, not from a conscious reaction. What changed first was the setting. In the first half of the 19th century, executions slowly left public squares and moved into prison courtyards. Crowds still came, and officials struggled to hold them back. France also faced a different problem. It called itself the birthplace of modern civilization and human rights, while still killing people in public. That split became harder to hide near Paris. Versailles stood just outside the capital. On June 17, 1939, outside Saint-Pierre prison, France held its last public guillotine execution. The condemned man was Eugen Weidmann, a German convicted of 6 murders. People had gathered through the night for a better view. Someone filmed the morning execution, and by the late 1930s, film no longer stayed inside one courtyard. The footage got out. Public reaction turned negative, and the authorities moved all future executions behind prison walls for good. The prison yard itself lasted only until September 10, 1977. By then, the ritual had shrunk to a silent prison yard. On September 10, 1977, officials guillotined 28-year-old Hamida Jandoubi in the courtyard of Baumet's prison in Marseille, southern France. A court convicted him of kidnapping, torturing, and murdering 21-year-old Elizabeth Bousquet after he had forced her into prostitution. Fewer than a dozen prison officials watched. No public notice went out. Soon after, France abolished the death penalty. Hamida Jandoubi was the last person killed by guillotine anywhere in the world.